Hello, everyone. Can everyone see my screen?
You can see your screen, yes.
Excellent. All right. So my name is Tanya Grinberg. Today, we're going to be talking about self-organization. Biological and social agents are very different from our present approaches to design artificial agents. Technological systems are constructed from outside in. They extend the part of the world with known functionality by forging its deterministic substrate into required functions. This is, however, this is true whether we are building a bicycle in a workshop or a learning algorithm in a software development environment. However, biological systems are growing from inside out. They organize an indeterministic substrate with unreliable properties into a structure that converges to serving the required function and which will even self-heal and regrow when they are being damaged or disturbed. Today, we will be exploring this dichotomy and how it applies to technological systems, especially artificial intelligence. So, our first presenter today will be Professor Christoph von der Malsburg. Today, Professor von der Malsburg is a senior fellow at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies and a visiting professor at the Institute of Neuroinformatics at ETH Zurich. Previously, he served as a research scientist at Max Planck Institute in Göttingen and professor of computer science, neuroscience, physics, and psychology at University of Southern California, and as director of the Institute of Neuroinformatics at Bochum University. He has founded 2 successful companies and has received many awards, including Pioneer Award of the Neural Network Council, IEEE, and the Heb Award of the International Neural Network Society. Christoph, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. Can I share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to. I will stop my share.
Yeah, continue. Okay. Here we go. So first, I would like to discuss how to determine the information content of the brain and of the environment with which the brain is dealing. And the right way of going about that is Kolmogorov complexity. The information content, according to it, the information content of the structure is measured in terms of the bit length of the shortest algorithm that creates that structure, that can create that structure. So let me give you a simple example. The Julia set is a very complicated thing. In order to describe it as is, you need literally an infinite amount of information. You can blow it up as long as you want, and it still continues to create more, to contain more structure. But in order to create it, it needs a few line algorithm, the guts of which are shown on the lower left. The flip side of low Kolmogorov complexity is that the structure it is describing is highly structured. It has high structural regularity, which is again displayed here. You can see there is a lot of structural regularity, which never repeats, but you can see the inner coherence of the whole thing. So what about our natural environment? I claim it has very low Kolmogorov complexity. Otherwise, we couldn't perceive it and science wouldn't work. And I think virtual reality is a very good tool to show that ordinary looking environments, including their dynamical interaction with a viewer, can be created with very little information. So the basis of that is computer graphics. In computer graphics, that's an amazing field that has developed over 20 or 30 years, the ability to create very realistically looking scenes and also dynamic scenes. They have created something like an ontology of our visual environment. And I guess you all know how it is done. It is a compositional game. You start with a representation of a shape, in terms of shapes, in terms of wire frame models. Then you give them surface markings and reflectivity. You transform them by known laws into a scene, and position them in a scene. You project the scene with projective geometry into a virtual camera, you illuminate it. So that is something that can be done with a few gigabytes of program code. Now, we all learn in a very deliberately designed simple environment, a nursery. And although this nursery is very limited in terms of numbers of samples and complexity, we later walk out into the world and can reflect it, represent it in our brain. Now, as I said, to generate this kind of, to simulate, if one cared to do that, that kind of environment, including the social interactions, it would take a few gigabytes of a program like a computer games program, a virtual reality program. So the Kolmogorov complexity of our environment as far as is needed for learning is gigabytes only. Now, let me remind you that at least to psychologists, the speed, the rate at which we pick up information into our long-term memory is a bit or so per second, so that over your whole lifetime, you pick up a gigabit. When I first heard that, I found that offenses to the richness of my inner life, but turned it the other way around and say it takes a gigabyte to create the world as I know it, to represent it. Now, the brain is a very complicated thing. A simple estimate of the amount of information you need to describe the wiring is a petabyte, 10 to the 15 bytes. Here's a little computation on the screen, how I arrived at that. But the Kolmogorov complexity of it must be very low. It takes 1 gigabyte of genetic information to create an organism like mine, including the brain. And as we saw, it takes a few gigabytes to train it to at least some level of competence. So the Kolmogorov complexity of the brain is very low. So that means the brain is highly structured. And I think this is the quarry theory has to shoot for, to describe the particular kind of structure that is dominating the brain. The question arises, what is the Kolmogorov algorithm by which the brain is actually created? Okay, as I said, the brain is dominated. No, here's my slide. The brain is the result of self-organization, of course, where the genes play the role of parametric control, and likewise the sensory signals. They just influence this process of self-organization, which, however, is totally dominated by the structure that we just concluded must be structuring it. So the brain is dominated by attractor patterns, and see that in analogy to crystals or to Turing patterns, if you heard of them, to soap bubbles, or the Golgi apparatus that is in all the eukaryotic cells, all the cells of your bottom. Those structures arise by the more or less chaotic interaction, dynamic interaction of the building elements of those systems. These patterns emerge, as one calls that. One speaks of emergence. They just arise because they can self-stabilize. They can prevail in a dynamic game. So that poses the very important question, what are the emerging patterns in the brain? There is, thank goodness, a very good paradigm for that has been studied 40 years ago, very intensively, I must say. I was in the middle of this, with dozens of different types of experiments done on frogs and fish. And the question is, how come that the fibers that grow out at some stage in the embryo from the retina on the left, and grow out to target structures in the brain, the optic tectum, for instance, here on the right, how come that these fibers, which at least in some species start out in a rather random pattern, order themselves over some time, till at the end you have a beautiful picture appearing here in the tectum when a picture is shone into the retina. A connectivity pattern where neighboring ganglion cells in the retina connect to neighboring cells in the tectum. How come these fibers know where to go? There was a handful of theories. All of them died given the enormous flexibility of the system, its resistance to experimental interventions and quirks of natural development. And the one that survived, and I was one of the people who proposed it with my friend David Wilshaw and Alexander Häusler, is network self-organization. So the claim is that is the Kolmogorov algorithm of the brain. And it works like so. A network, an initially more or less random network, creates signals. The signals act back on the network by synaptic plasticity. And this loop, this initially unstable loop, continues until a network structure is reached that stabilizes itself via the signals, that creates signals that stabilize that same network. And retinotopy is just one example of that. So by some leap of faith, one has to see, or if you don't take it as a logical conclusion, one has to see the structure of the brain as an overlay of lots of self-organized network patterns. These attractor networks are characterized by two properties. One is the consistency of different pathways. A single pathway can only grow if it gets cooperative help from other pathways coming from the same source, going to the same target, cooperativity. And this is bridled in by a sparsity constraint. Sparsity meaning a limited number of inputs to the same neuron or outputs from the same neuron. That's a simple characterization of attractor networks. So the idea is that the brain is an overlay of lots of attractor nets, each having its own support as a set of neurons. And each time that set of neurons is active, it works a little bit on its connectivity until it has reached attractor structure. And each neuron can be part of a number of attractor nets. So the central thesis towards I have been driving is the emergent nets, self-organized nets, are the brain's bias. And this is a very bold, it took me a while to sort of put my belief behind this. This is a very bold statement, of course, saying that the mechanics of network self-organization is at the base of the structure of our mind, the structure of our brain. That is one half of that hypothesis. And the other one is the structures that arise by this mechanics are a powerful bias to understand the environment. Any statistical learning mechanism needs to have a very strong bias that tunes it to the phenomenon that is to be learned from. And so the idea here is, the conclusion here is, that the bias in our brain is network self-organization. The attractor nets are the data structure of the mind. They form a construction kit for mind states. They are the Lego blocks of the mind, of the chunks of cognitive theory. And the syntax, the grammar under which they combine into each other is any combination of coactive networks has to form a stabilized, a self-organized, a attractor net that would be, given enough time, be stable under self-organization. It's in principle a very simple system. Let me just give a simple illustration to make it more concrete. Face recognition, that was the base, at the base of two companies I've co-founded in the past in California, in Germany, successful companies. So the idea is the image of an object or a face enters primary visual cortex, as we all know, as a 2D array of local feature detectors, which are, as we also know, connected, laterally connected by short range connections. So it is a tiny step from there to assuming that what the input image activates is local connectivity fragments of connectivity, which seamlessly blend into each other to represent the whole face. In order to recognize it, you need a model of that face in another part of the brain, a fusiform complex. And in order to establish the relationship, the similarity relationship, you need fiber projections between a primary visual cortex and the inferotemporal cortex, which links corresponding parts to each other. These projection networks have to switch as quickly as the images change in primary cortex. They are called shifter circuits by Charles Anderson and by David van Essen. Now, let me just point out that the whole structure here that arises in a fraction of a second when you look at a face is an attractor network. It is composed of lots of little net fragments that have been previously prepared and that fuse into each other to form this representation. So let me go one step further and submit the idea that we comprehend objects by linking them, sensory objects, by linking them to schematic description thereof, schematic description that are put together by network fragments that have been trained before. So let me come to my end and repeat my central thesis. Emergent nets are the brain's spires. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. That was an excellent presentation. So.
You want me to stop sharing, I suppose.
Yes, you could do that. I think the share will be interrupted when György starts. So our next presenter is Professor György Buzsáki. György Buzsáki is the Biggs Professor of Neuroscience, NYU School of Medicine, and is among the top 0.2% of most cited neuroscientists. His work has contributed to the emerging understanding of the dynamics of hippocampal system and the recognition of the importance of temporal firing properties in the formation of neural codes. His overarching hypothesis is that the numerous rhythms that the brain perpetually generates are responsible for segmentation of neural information and communication across brain regions. He proposed how these rhythms support a brain syntax, a physiological basis of cognitive operations. His most influential work is known as the two-stage model of memory trace consolidation and has been adopted as a framework at several leading laboratories around the world. György, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Tatiana. Let me use this opportunity to ask a few questions and then I go to my real presentation. The first thing I like to ask is that, what makes us so successful as a species? And the answer is that we are perhaps the only or very exceptional species that was capable of externalizing brain function. We expand the body and we expand the brain. We make machines, clocks, rulers, computers to help us and obey us, not to substitute or compete with us. Now, if you take this position, then you can ask, how is AI? And why do we call it artificial intelligence in the first place? It always bugged me. What if we are talking about artificial smartness, artificial creativity, thinking, or artificial consciousness? Did it just happen that AI survived, and because that was a community agreement? And what if for Neumann named a computer an artificial brain? Then we would be having a branch sponsored by governments, and we would be all researching artificial brains. Now, what is so special about intelligence? Intelligence in biology is typically defined as the ability of the species to survive and prosper in its own niche. And the emphasis to me is on niche, because it would be unfair to put a human underwater for 10 minutes and then conclude that the fish are more intelligent. All species survive and perform in their own niche. And the question is then, what is the niche for AI? If every intelligent agent requires a environment to live, what is AI's defined environment? Now, when you would like to do a artificial version of something or anything, we need to have a good definition of the real thing first. And let's see how it works with intelligence. Like space and time, intelligent is an abstract, deduced idea. Ideas become scientific only when we begin to measure them. Measuring needs scales. Time and space became scientific terms when we began to measure duration and distance by clocks and rulers. Intelligence also became a scientific term when we made up a scale for measuring IQ. Historically, this was introduced as a tool for selecting soldiers during the First World War for particular goals. Goals is a very important thing. This was classification can happen only in the presence of a goal. But today, the goals of AI are very different. Different groups of people come up with their own creative definitions and relay them to their own rulers. Unfortunately, there is no agreed common ruler against which we can measure intelligence of humans, other animals, machines, and computer algorithms. So when it comes to defining AI, one may wonder, this is a fantastic system or a field that can live alone, or indeed, as some people say, AI should be inspired by the brain, or whether brain scientists like myself should be looking out for AI people like you guys to see how much we can steal from you to understand the brain. So in order to do that, we would like to see is that what kind of aspects or hypotheses or statements AI is using currently from brain models. Now, I have to share the screen here. And there we go. Share presenters view. And let's go. So we can distinguish basically three extreme versions of how we think about brains in general. One is, I would say, is still dominant, and is based on the keywords like random organization, egalitarian, Hebb rules, EI balance, noise, and sleep plays no importance whatsoever. We create robots so they can work 24 hours a day, and we create algorithms to work 24 hours a day, but we humans and other animals sleep also. Now, the whole idea here is that you start with a simple brain and make it more and more complex, and the complexity scales with experience. You can call this model doublerasa and writing in. And Christoph very eloquently already pointed out that this is not the kind of brains or most brain scientists look at or imagine. Brains have internal dynamics, and it's a common word, but we don't really explain what it is. So I give it a try and explain it what it is. So the alternative of the AI-like or the the tabula rasa or the Blake slang model would be an alternative, which is an autonomous system, a self-organized system, which has very different rules. Instead of egalitarian, it has strong skewed rules. And sleep is an essential feature that is necessary to maintain its own dynamics. And instead of the clean paper, the brains come with a pre-configured dynamic, and that pre-configured dynamic gives you an enormous realm of possibilities, typically sequences. And learning in this, under this model is not a synthesis, it's not putting something into the brain, but unmasking and matching an existing pattern with the experience. Now, the way how we can summarize these two models in just very simple sentences, this is the famous short summary of Hebb, is that neurons that fire together wire together. In the other hand, you can say that neurons that are born together will wire together. Therefore, they will fire together with a much higher probability than neurons that are not born together. Now, this is a very simplified view, of course, of the brain, and I have check marks here saying which side I prefer. And of course, you would like to know whether there are supports for any of these things. I have never met anybody in my neuroscience community who would say, oh, the brain is a tabula rasa. But there are famous people, such as this guy here, who said exactly that. It's not so long ago that there's a notebook and then you have to fill it up with experience. Here's another giant, John Hopfield, who not so long ago said, a large number of simple equivalent components. So this is exactly where a majority of AI people live on, and I'm happy to hear you contradicting me. And of course, there are new areas of AI that are different and they are more brain inspired, but I think by and large, even neuroscience is following these principles. In contrast, if we are looking for fundamental laws or fundamental rules in the brain, then there are not too many. This is not like physics, but at least we have one overwhelming rule in the brain. This is called the Weber-Fechner law, which describes our subjective perception as a log rule. And there were many, many attempts to show why this is the case. And it's also not only for our perceptions, but it applies to almost everything, such as short-term memory, long-term memory, space, duration perception, and so on. The fundamental reason, I think, why this log rule occurs is because the brain has a dynamic range, extraordinarily wide dynamic range in almost everything, from synaptic waves to firing rates, population synchrony, and so on. They also show a lot of log normal distribution or log normal-like distributions. And this dynamic is based by a skewed system, which is, as Christoph already pointed out, this is not random organization at all, but connectivity can be described by a log rule, which means that one area of the brain is connected to a handful of other areas in the brain very strongly. 50% of these connections are to a handful of areas, but the other 50% is to a very large number of other areas with weak connections. And this is what is expressed by the log rule. So of course, these are interesting observations. These are only statistics, but the question is whether these are statistical curiosities only, or they serve something interesting. And I think what they serve is exactly what the brain have to solve, which is a fight. It's a continuous struggle of a war between wide dynamic range, stability, resilience, homeostasis, redundancy, degeneracy, and this is one end. The other end, if you want, will be plasticity and robustness. So if these are fundamental rules of the brains, then we know that there are small brains and large brains, and how are they react in their niche where they live? And the answer is that, no, not the answer, but my hypothesis is that the main goal of the brain is to maintain its own dynamic. Second is to generate an output and to see the consequences of its output and predict the consequences of its output. So this simple creature is generating an output. It interacts with the body and with its own niche in the environment, and then it invents sensors to make the prediction better. And the goal, of course, is to predict the consequences of its own actions. Now, brains grow, they get larger. There are many, many loops added to this, but the entire goal of this is exactly the same. But now, this organism, such as your brain and my brain, can predict the future at a much longer time scale and in a much more noisy, complex environment. Now, this is not yet cognition. There is one more trick here. Namely, we have to disengage the brain from the world. The reason why I see is not because there are photons on my retina. I can see, I close my eyes and the screen doesn't appear. I can still see Tatiana and everybody on the screen in my mind, is because what we see is actually the brain computation. And if that is true, then we can temporarily or for a longer time disengage or remove from the environment and keep going on with the computation and do and compute what if scenarios. What if I didn't wake up this morning early enough to come to this talk, and what would be the consequences of this? Therefore, I put my alarm clock and so on. So these are the kind of things that this complex brain can do. Now, there is one more bug that is complicated, because all you see is here is loops, and complicated loops and interactive loops. And this looks like a thalamocortical system. But besides our cortex and the thalamus, there are two tricks here. One is that the brain has invented side loops. There are two side loops here, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. They are first cousins. They like each other, they compute similar things, and they complement each other. And the third loop is the hippocampus. So you may wonder, if you would like to make an AI system, why are these side loops, what they are good for, and how they work. So in the rest of my time, I'd like to show you some examples how they actually work. So my first claim was that the number one goal for the brain is to maintain its own dynamics. Is it expensive, or does it come for free? So recently, Dan Levinstein, a grad student in my lab, devoted his 5 years here and calculated. What we did is that what you see on the left is the distribution of interspike intervals. That is how regular spikes spike or work. And we know that they are pretty irregular most of the time. And in the x-axis, you can do this interspike interval, and every single line, there are a few thousand neurons here in the hippocampus. Every line is the interspike interval distribution of a neuron. And you can see is that there is this nice shift that is different from neuron to neuron. So there are fingerprints, there are neuron characteristic firing patterns, which is on the low end of the firing. This can be 0 to 0.01, 0.001, very low frequency firing, which bothered many people for a long time. Why do neurons fire at such a low rate? That doesn't make sense. They cannot do anything except perhaps discharging their partner interneurons, but they don't have any information value. Now, it turns out that there are other regimes, such as here, you can see a band here, that all neurons are in the same band. This is, in the hippocampus, this is the theta band. Or there is another band here about gamma. There's another one here, is a bursting pattern and so on. So by analogy to physics, we call this state here the individual specific state, the ground state. And then the other states that are common to all neurons, or most of the neurons, are the activated states. So this is shown here in a cartoon manner, that every neuron can have its own ground state and its activated state. Activated states means they are working together with many other neurons for a purpose. Now, what fraction of the neurons spend in the ground state to do nothing, or to maintain neural dynamics, nothing meaning no communication, no perception, no thinking, and so on? And the answer is astonishingly high. This is a figure that shows the hippocampus, the piriform cortex, basolateral amygdala, frontal cortex, visual cortex, the thalamus. Doesn't matter where you go and what state, whether it's sleep or waking, most of the spikes everywhere in the brains are devoted to maintain the brain dynamic. Okay, so I made my first point. My second point is that there are many neurons that are silent, or they are firing these scattered spikes, such as the ones I just showed you, that they are in the ground state. So, for example, if you are a place neuron, you can see my cursor here. Probably, if the animal is running in an environment and you are recording from the hippocampus, then there are place cells, and this is place cell number 1, place cell number 2, place cell number 3, 4, and so on. But there are half or more of the neurons that are like these yellow cells that they don't do anything. What are they part of this attractor that Christoph was talking about, or they are distinct from each other? So how do we know that? The way how to do it is do a trick. What Manuel Valero did is optogenetically activate this cell for a short period of time, and again, short period of time, periodically 20 milliseconds for thousands of times. That doesn't perturb the system, and ask, how are you? And then the neuron fires a spike, and then it fires a spike, another spike. So now this neuron, the same neuron that you have seen before that doesn't have any place field, all of a sudden now does have a place field. So we show that, and this place field is married to a particular position, just like normal place fields are. And here is another one. And then there are many of these. In fact, most of them, if you have the probing done right. So the middle one would be the noisy one that you wouldn't see otherwise, because the firing rates are too low compared to outside the field, and we don't know where the field is. But if you probe the neuron, then we can unmask place fields from every single CA1 pyramidal neuron in the hippocampus.
1 minute.
So it is part of the same exact attractor, except it doesn't spike. It doesn't have an output. So unmasking is as effective as making. So remember that on the one hand, you have to synthesize, you have to make neurons, and you make them fire the way how the world makes them fire. Or the other one is that it just happens when you are searching into something, there's a high probability that a particular pattern occurs, and that pattern can be associated or linked to something meaningful. So where do these pre-configured lists of sequences come from? And the answer is perhaps from either evolution or embryonic states. So now we are doing a little bit of neuro archaeology, and we are asking is that if you are recording from an adult brain, how would we be smarter to know how this neuron should behave if we know that this neuron and another neuron were born in the same day or in a different day? And to do that, Roman Huszár in my lab, he labels neurons at different stages of development, such as embryonic stage 13, 14, 15, and 16 days, mark them permanently. So when the animals grow up, then we can compare the adult animals and know which neurons were born on the same day and which neurons were not. And the answer is, even if we go to those neurons that were born together, they will fire together in the same theta cycle, the same sharp wave cycles. At the population level, they like to be together. They form cell assemblies. And even at the very extreme level, this black neuron was born on 14 days, and it has one field and it has another field. The blue neuron was born on the same day and it has a similar field. And the red neuron was born on a different day, it has a dissimilar field. And if you do the statistics on a large number of neurons, we find that neurons that are born together, they do many things similarly, and they fire together and fire together. Well, this brings us to the new brain picture, which is my spaghetti brain, which suggests that we are not making complex brain from simple brains. Brains are devoting their enormous resources to maintain the dynamic. That brain dynamic does not change or scales with learning or experience. My brain, your brain, or that of a totally unexperienced brain, or the brain of Albert Einstein, are not necessarily different in complexity, because learning is not adding, but it's a matching process. In the spaghetti, the thicker ones that have already been associated or linked to experience. And so, with an analogy, it would be like a Chinese dictionary where there are many symbols. All the symbols are there for communication. We just don't understand them, but we have to ground them by knowledge, such as knowledge of English words, or in our case is experience. So the interesting challenge to AI, if you are interested in brain-inspired system, maybe we should be looking at the right end of my first slide, which is this slide here, that we can create a system that already has a realm of possibilities for matching, but another requirement that that system should be supporting a goal. It has to live in a niche. It has to be embodied. It has to have a thing that is deciding or constraining the features that it can support with its self-organized complexity. And I have a few more things to say, but if you're interested, then just read this book. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, György. That was an excellent presentation. So next up, we have Professor Dave Ackley. Let me quickly create a spotlight. Okay. So David Ackley is Emeritus Professor of Computer Science at University of New Mexico. David received his PhD from Carnegie Mellon University. Before starting his academic position at the University of New Mexico, he was a member of the Cognitive Science Research Group at Belcour. His ongoing research interests center on artificial life models and real artificial life. Current research emphases include genetic algorithms and programming, distributed and social computing, robust self-aware systems, and computer security. Dave, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Tanya. I wasn't exactly sure how I fit in here. Christoph is an incredible legend. I mean, I started doing computer neural networks in the 80s in graduate school, and I was already reading his papers. And György's talk was just an incredibly perfect setup for what I want to say. My interest is making computers do new things by themselves, because that's cool. And so I've been doing that my entire career. And the big problem is, of course, is that once I've gotten them to do it, it's not cool anymore. So I have to kind of keep moving on, keep feeding them all with new cool stuff. So I went from neural networks to genetic algorithms to artificial life, started doing biological approaches to computer security, trying to do automated diversity generation to try to make it so that, if there are going to be bugs in software, and there were going to be bugs in software, well, then maybe the attacker would have to solve a different problem for each copy of Excel rather than just being able to kill all of them at once. And, by the late 00s, I was depressed about computer security. I was depressed about the impossibility of fixing computer security, and the problem wasn't that we couldn't get users to change their passwords or apply patches, or that programmers were incompetent, or that managers ship crap. Although all those things are true, the problem is, even if those were all fixed, we still would have incredible computer security problems that are just getting worse and are going to continue to get worse as people figure out how to exploit the incredible fact that the way we've designed computers is one bug is all it takes to take over the entire machine. And, physical systems, living systems, brain systems are not like that. I mean, except in very, very rare circumstances. And so I said, well, what is the actual problem here? And the problem is, I've concluded the underlying architecture of computation. The CPU and random access model is broken. I mean, it's fine for small systems, but as the system gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it's terrible. And so my goal is to say, well, how can we come up with a new architecture which will be more inherently robust, much more like the attractor networks, the overlapping attractor networks that Christoph was talking about, much more like the brain spaghetti that György was just showing, and yet still be able to engineer with it somehow. And my answer is, well, number one, we have to stop eating the glass sandwich. And this is the glass sandwich. The idea is the purpose of a computation is to connect physics to value, to connect matter to money, to put not too fine a point on it. And the way we do that is we build hardware. We build these digital electronic circuits that in fact have tremendous redundancy in them. A wire that we use to carry one bit could easily carry dozens or hundreds or thousands of different values with some degree of error, but we don't do that. We send one bit down it and we stick amplifiers everywhere to squish that one bit back over and over and over again. And that heroic act of redundancy in digital circuitry is what makes the hardware so reliable that the software level can just assume that it's perfect. It just assume.
And trick to present a synchronous universe.
I need to find the best way to learn math and science.
Okay. I'm not sure who I heard. The circuitry of electronic circuitry is incredibly redundant, and therefore software can be incredibly non-redundant. And that's baked into the DNA of computer science. The whole idea is you should never, don't repeat yourself. That's a mantra in software engineering. You should use caches. If you've computed something, you should remember it. Don't compute it again. And all of that is built on top of the idea of we have to trust the hardware is perfect. But that guarantee that hardware provides always has an asterisk because, of course, there is still some probability of failure, some probability of an undetected error coming up from the hardware level and reaching the software level. We just engineer it so that it's low enough that we can finish playing solitaire or doing whatever program we want to do with having vanishingly low chance of anything going wrong. Similarly, once the computations get really, really big, like data center level, tens of thousands of these machines all owned by a single organization, they start seeing them failing because that remaining level of failure is there. And they start applying robustness features. But for everybody else, there's basically, electronic circuit robustness, and then this fragile and incredibly efficient, which equals incredibly non-redundant, incredibly fragile, non-robust software built on top. And the claim is, the suggestion is, we have to stop eating the glass sandwich. And here's my conclusions. This is a 12-step program for inventing a new architecture that, in fact, almost completely inverts the design assumptions that underlie deterministic execution with CPU and RAM. And I won't have anywhere near enough time to go through all of these, but several of them have already been mentioned. Self-stabilization was mentioned. Number 7, look at life for lessons. That's what I take from both György and Christoph, using their studying the brain and studying the nervous systems of animals and people and everything for understanding about how these things work. And the fact that, for example, brains aren't just sitting there, they're doing stuff all the time. If you want to do something with a brain, you have to work with the dynamics that it's got. That's very different than a computer with memory just sitting there empty. You load it up with a program and then it does whatever you wish. So it begins with step 1. Admit we have a problem. And for me, that is driven by computer security. I think, 50 years from now, hopefully less, our great grandkids will not believe the world that we lived in as far as computer security goes today. The computers we have today are so unbelievably gullible. I mean, one mistake. I mean, they're like complete idiots. You know, you just talk to them and they become zombies. It's like a horror movie where all you have to do is say the thing, and then they start sending spam to Russia for you or whatever it is that they do. And that is not the way it has to be. That is the way it is because the way we've designed the glass sandwich, but we could do something else. And so, you know, the idea is instead of thinking about correctness and efficiency only at software, we have to think in terms of robustness first, think robust first, and admit we have a problem. We can sing the whole song, pick new metrics, and so on. But I won't do that. I just want to get a little bit more, unpack the idea, show a few demos, and then stop there and let's go with discussion for it, okay? So here's the answer. The answer to how to stop eating the glass sandwich is go for structure at all scales. And rather than saying we've got physics, we've got hardware that produces universality as close to the physics as possible, and then it's all just software, we're going to say, no, actually, we want to delay universality and have that happen much closer to the value. And we want instead, just like György was talking about, just like Craig was talking about, have attractor nets, things that self-stabilize, things that have their own internal goals other than get the credit card number. Yes, we have to get the credit card number at the end, otherwise we can't pay for the whole operation. But we want to do it with things inside that are worrying about their own goals. You know, is everything all cleaned up? Do I have enough room to work? Do I have enough copies or enough cousins and brothers and so forth that are available to do it in case something happens to me, and so forth. And they themselves are made of even smaller systems like that. So rather than saying, you know, it's turtles all the way down, we want to build bottom up and say, you know, it's thermostats all the way up, made out of more and more and more complicated ones layered on. And I want to engineer that. I want to actually build that. Learn by implementing them. You know, we can learn by studying the brain. We can learn by studying animals. That's great, but that's not what I do. I want to do it by building it and seeing cool new things happen. All right. So, I've already said this, don't blame the users, the programmers, the managers, blame the architecture. In particular, blame random access memory, you know, which is this wonderful thing. And it's far, far too wonderful because the instant we manage to knock a program off its kilter, once you have this huge field of opportunities, you can find anything you need, a little bit here, a little bit there, 17 of these, carry a loop, make a thing, divide by one. You're doing whatever you wish. How do you stop that? What we have now, all the stuff that we're doing now, the people doing computer security work, you know, we got to do it because here's the engineering field that we're currently living in. We got to play it as it lays, but it's patch, patch, patch. I mean, not just for the users, but for the whole idea. It's a glass dam that is going to spring leaks. We have to keep patching it up or the whole thing's going to go to hell. But we could, if we wanted, actually start to build another dam a little further away out of sterner stuff, out of stuff that's got built out of ripstop nylon instead of out of brittle glass. And in order to do that, we have to ditch random access memory. And what are we going to replace it with if we get rid of random access memory? Well, the suggestion I make is it's going to be some kind of cellular automata. Now, if you're not familiar with cellular automata, it's the idea of instead of having one big central processing unit and one massive RAM, you have a whole bunch of teeny little processors with little teeny bits of RAM, and they only talk to nearest neighbors or nearest 2 or 3 neighbors or whatever it is, some limited neighborhood that is all that they can get to. And there's no general purpose pointer. They cannot go, whoa, I need that little bit and this little bit. So does that mean everything's guaranteed to be fine? No. Does that mean everything is safe? No. But it does mean that if an attack is going to be mustered in the most critical moments, when you first knock the system off kilter, you have a very little bit of stuff to work with. And it's all very delicate, and you have to do a land war. You have to take over the next stop and the next bit and the next bit and spread it rather than going, boom, I won. Now, most people that are familiar with cellular automata, they're familiar with things like Conway's Game of Life, and that has a two characteristics that I don't like. And in particular, number one, it's deterministic. So it inherits that exact same flaw, that believing in perfect hardware that CPU and RAM inherits from. And if we're trying to get around the problems that CPU and RAM and deterministic execution are causing, we have to give up on deterministic execution. We have to admit that there will be flaws and they have to be handled. Software can't just say reliability is a hardware problem. And number two, it can't be synchronous. The whole thing can't go ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk at once, because the whole point of cellular automata is that it can get bigger. We can add more. We can grow the thing out. And the bigger the thing gets, the worse synchronization becomes. There's a bunch of tricks you can do that people keep discovering every decade or two about ways to kind of lay a synchronous thing on top of an asynchronous thing, but they all rely on deterministic execution. If there's a possibility of errors, that means the synchronous overlay actually locks up. The entire universe grinds to a halt. Not a good outcome for having one bit flip. So we have to embrace asynchronous, fallible hardware and say, how could we program on that? And wow, that's harder than programming on CPU and RAM. But hey, we know a little bit more about software now than we did when we first invented the von Neumann machine and all the subsequent CPU and RAM stuff. So that's the idea. How do we make a cellular automata? Got it. That's can be indefinitely scalable. We make it by making an individual tile, a chunk of cellular automata that can connect with others of its own kind, and we can just keep plugging it out. So here, this is a T2 tile. This is the specific tile that I've been working on for the last decade or so. It's a small project, so it's going slowly. But in fact, we had an earlier version called the Illuminato Ex Machina back in 2008 that similarly, it's a 2D thing that you plug them together and so forth. Those were actually briefly marketed. And now, more recently, we have the T2 tiles, the one that I just showed you. And these things are, you know, ridiculous, huge, heavy, hot, $100 expensive each, because they're a research prototype. And, you know, the key is to figure out what we want, to figure out a new deal between hardware and software. And then, yes, the hardware guys can come in and figure out how to do this beautiful, but we have to know what we want first. So that's it. There's the T2 Tile project has bi-weekly videos on YouTube. There's also a T2 demos, which just shows examples of the stuff running. And, you know, we've got a new programming language called Ulam, which is a procedural language for coding up transition rules for these things. We also have a spatial programming language called Splat, where you actually can make these little diagrams, you know, little ASCII pictures saying this 2D pattern goes to that 2D pattern and so forth. And that, you know, is very simple, but it made stuff possible. It made stuff work like that I'd been trying to get to work forever. Now, I'm just going to show you this one, and then I guess I'll stop because my 15 minutes are up. One of the big problems with asynchronous cellular automata is, how do you move a big thing? How do you move something that's bigger than you can move all at once? If it's synchronous, you kind of imagine going chunk in one step. But when it's asynchronous, you can't. You have to somehow break it down. And that's what this example was doing. It's the little blue guys that go through, they create swap lines that come up and pass through the rectangle. And each time they pass through the matrix moves one step in the opposite direction. That's what a swap line does. So a swap line is designed so that it never gets more than 45 degrees down the line. So it's a limited amount of synchronization. The passing of the line is a certain degree of synchronization. So that's just one example of learn by doing. This is another example. I'll just let this run, I guess, and we'll end. This is taking a plate, a grid of sites that communally say, let's create a common spatial origin. Let's create a 0, 0 and a 2020 or whatever it is. There's no overall grid coordinates in the underlying architecture. There's no 0, 0 because it's indefinitely scalable. There's no beginning. Everything just thinks it's the center of the universe and it goes from there. But that doesn't mean we can set up our own private little one. And once we do that, we can do all kinds of things with it. So this is more stuff with plates. Oh, and I'll just jump to this last one, if I can. Right. There it is. This is an incredibly lame neural network, kind of, encoded in and movable feast machine written in Ulam. And here it is actually running. So the two blocks that you see on the upper side are crossbar matrices that connect inbound wires and outbound wires, and they each have a weight at the connection. And then down, so it's actually doing a simple function optimization where the one on the upper left represents the function, the one on the upper right represents the knowledge that the algorithm is gaining, and then it actually had a little a little data readout on the screen to produce human output. So that's it. I will stop there, and it's going incredibly slow, but hopefully some folks will be inspired. You know, step 11 is, you know, we have to make it happen. We have to get organized and so forth. And this is not going to be running Excel in a year. This is a long-term fundamental research project to kind of go for a mulligan, to kind of do a do-over. Instead of having determinism at the bottom, we have determinism at the top. Instead of having data center software reliability at the top, we have it at the bottom, and so on. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, David. From the chat, I see this was an extremely inspiring presentation for a lot of people. Okay,
all right.
I'll switch to Joscha. So our final presenter today is Dr. Joscha Bach. Joscha Bach is a cognitive scientist and AI researcher with a focus on computational models of cognition and neurosymbolic AI. He has taught and worked in AI research at Humboldt University of Berlin, the Institute for Cognitive Science in Osnabrück, the MIT Media Lab, the Harvard Program for Evolutionary Dynamics, and is currently a principal AI researcher at Intel Labs, California. Joscha, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. So the machine that builds the machine is a very interesting topic when we think about the brain, because our mind is something that is not just designed as a technological system from the outside in, but as biological and social systems are from the inside out. If we look at this difference, when we design a system in our lab, we start from a deterministic environment and we take a substrate into this environment that is not structured yet in the way in which we want it to be structured, but we can fully control it. And we extend our determinism into this new part of the universe to basically extend our deterministic world into this particular thing. So we are coming from the outside in technological design. And if you look at a biological system, you do not have this deterministic environment to start with. Instead, you have an indeterministic environment, and you start out with some seed that needs to colonize the environment, to branch out, to subdue it, to turn it into something that the seed knows how to deal with, and then gradually turn its own structure. And when you go beyond simple organic growth, you look at organismic growth, where you already know the structure around you because you have created it, or you are part of something that had a shared destiny at some point. And so now you have known units around you with which you can collaborate and organize. And so you are colonizing the outside, and internally you are organizing from the ground up, from local units inside out. And we can ask ourselves what an organism is. Does an organism actually exist, right? We sometimes think of organisms as things, but the organism is a virtual thing. It's a function that describes a coherent pattern in the activity of many cells, right? So the individual cells are all serving that function, and by making them coherent due to evolutionary pressure and the design constraints that are built into the cells as a result of that, you see a coherent pattern emerging. And this coherent pattern that we see emerging, that is the causal structure that we call the organism. And the organism, like every other thing that exists, to exist is to be implemented, is implemented to some extent. But it's not implemented in the way in which a computer chip is implemented, but the degree of approximation is much more vague. And it's the organism exists to the degree that the patterns in the interaction of the cells in the organism are coherent. So in some sense, we see a pattern of this organization, a software that emerges over this information processing that looks as if there is a coherent agent that is inhabiting this thing. And traditionally, the word for this emergent operating system for an autonomous robot in nature is called spirit. And so in this sense, the emergent agency that we see in organisms is actually what was called spirits by the previous civilization. And these spirits also happen to be in our own minds, and they also happen to emerge in groups of people, nation states, and ecosystems, and so on. And these spirits are virtual machines that possess agency. That is, they play a controlling role while being able to model the future and their own place in the universe to some degree, and they are approximately implemented. And so in this sense, the spirit is a very high level of an organization that is required to see the emergence of such a spirit. And when we look at the hierarchy of causal systems at the lowest level, we may have something like our automata, like the game of life. And these automata, they can already be Turing complete. It's not that they are limited in any way. If you give them some memory and so on, they can implement arbitrarily complex structure if you set them up in the right way. But you need to do this from the outside via some kind of design process. The only automaton that might be able to do this without it, with a random starting state, is our universe itself. That might be a big automaton at its bottom level, and we just happen to inhabit a region in it that has interesting enough complexity to contain us. If you look at a mechanism that is slightly more complicated than than an automaton, that's usually a stateful thing, and it is entwined with a substrate. Here I use as an example the famous machines by, sorry, my brain is blanking out. Sorry, Tanya, you know his name? Theo Jansen's Strand Beasts, and he has been building these amazing machines that are driven usually by wind power, and they're completely mechanical things that are fully coupled with the environment, that don't have an existence that is in the sense independent of the environment. And if you look at feedback systems, you can have open loop systems that are coupled. For instance, in oscillators and in synthesizers, you produce interesting patterns that are the result of some static coupling. And if you make this coupling dynamic, for instance, in the regulator for a steam engine, you can have a cybernetic control system. And the controller in the cybernetic system is built by having a system that cares about the target value and wants to minimize the distance to the target value. And if you extend this controller with computation, you can get an agent. And to have this decoupling of this ability to model the future, you need to have a system that is a computer. A Turing machine, in some sense, is a mechanism that is disentangling itself, decoupling a causal structure from the underlying dynamic of the universe. The interesting thing about our computers is that they do the same thing regardless of what the environment is doing. They work the same way, whether you are carrying them to America or New York, or whether the temperature is a few degrees higher or lower, or whether you climb a mountain or go down, or whether the wind is blowing or not. And the same kind of computer also exists inside of our skulls. It's a slightly different one, but this principle of the computer is that enables an arbitrary causal structure. And you need to have this arbitrary causal structure to be able to make models of the future, right? Because you want to look at different futures, regardless of what the universe is doing right now. And the simple system that we know in nature that is, in the sense, Turing complete and has the powers of functional approximation and self-organization to achieve that is the cell. So the cell basically is able to perform computations that are decoupled from its immediate substrate, and that enable the cell to make models that predict the future, so the cell can regulate against future disturbances and keep itself stable against these disturbances. So, and that's why the cell as such a complex system is able to exist. So the cell is an agent, and an agent is basically a controller combined with an internal set point generator and the ability to model the future. So the agent is not just acting like a thermostat on the next frame and tries to optimize the state of the next frame, but it's integrating the expected set point deviations over the future and tries to minimize them. And if the modeling capacity is sufficient, then this agent is able to model different branches of the universe and the effect that its decisions will have on these branches. And as a result, you basically get beliefs, desires, and intentions all emergent from a simple controller that is able to model the future. So this is basically a minimal concept of agency. And agents can start to collaborate with each other and as groups of agents. And groups agents will typically have individual motivation and a reputation system among the agents that makes sure that their actions are harmonious and beneficial to the members of the group. And slightly different extension of the group agent is a state building agent. A state building agent is one that scales beyond a reputation system. It means that the individuals do not have to know each other individually to have to maintain a model of their reputation and their transaction and synchronize this reputation system somehow like a tribe does. A state is fundamentally different from the tribe because the members of the state become interchangeable. They have functional roles now. And these state building agents can grow very large. But the size of the state building agents depends on the size of the effective colonial structure that it can maintain. So basically the logistics chain. To build such a colony of units that are synchronized, the state needs to have a way to impose administration on its substrate and extract more neg entropy from the substrate than the administration costs. And this limits the size of the design of a state building system, especially once you have such a state building system and evolution, it's going to compete with similar systems for the same neg entropy. Right? So you are basically the set of principles that has outcompeted all other systems from extracting neg entropy from your volume of space. And to do this, you need to impose coordinated patterns of organization onto your volume of space. And this, because you're competing with others, limits the size that you can have. And there are very few organisms that have cracked the code and have become infinitely scaling state building agents, right? Most state building systems have a limited size. Their design is limited by the stable logistics chain that they can use to impose their colony onto the environment. And this here, for instance, is the Pando forest. It's ash trees in Utah. It's one of the largest organisms that we have on Earth. All these trees are the same tree. They're not just genetic clones of each other, but their roots are connected. This is basically one big tree that can grow as large as it wants. It's very old and it didn't mutate very much since its growth, right? So it needs to be evolutionarily stable so it doesn't drift. Another example for an infinitely scaling state building agent is Lindipithema humile. It's a Brazilian ant that has spread around the world, and all members of this ant, of these ant colonies will not attack each other. They will all treat each other as part of the same cohesive colony, with the exception of a few drifted colonies, for instance, in the US. When they get in touch with the other colonies, they will attack each other. So they had some kind of genetic drift after the colony was established that makes them appear to be strangers to each other. But this species has cracked the problem of becoming an infinitely scaling state. There's no limit to the size of this colony, apparently. And if you look at the design constraints for such systems, so the mechanical component needs to have an outside-in design by some external agent. So it is not going to exist by itself, and it's not able to adapt by itself. And when you build a controller gets resilience that can be larger than the mechanical component because it's able to adapt its states to a slightly changing environmental circumstances and maintain an attractor state by itself via dynamic control. And if your controller is able to model the future via decoupled computation, then it's able to integrate future reward and is able to not just adapt itself to the environment, but it's also able to adapt the environment to itself. And in a group agent, you can do this on the next level. So you basically build an agent that is composed of multiple sub-agents. And each of these sub-agents has its individual motivation and a reputation system to coordinate the group. And in a state building agent, you change this reputation system or extend it via hierarchical governance. And this thing needs an immune system. So the individuals are submitting to this governance and are not building their own government that is competing with the main government. And you will have limited autonomy of the sub-agents. So they will be set up in such a way that they, per default, most of them will want to submit to the state building group rather than doing their own thing.
3 minutes.
And you can see this in humans. We are basically a domesticated species of the hominids. And as a result, we're not just tribal. Homo sapiens is state building because the most of the individuals in our species are willing to submit to the group before they do their own thing. And if you go to an infinitely scalable state building agent, you can do at some level less than you can do in these other groups because you need to be static. You cannot have an evolutionary drift. You cannot adapt to the environment beyond the mechanisms that are built into the system. Because if you were to drift, then this infinite scale would break and you would no longer be consistent. So if you think of hierarchical governance as a principle, we have a trade-off there between adaptivity and coherence in the system. The more adaptive it is, the harder it is to maintain coherence. And the individual agents here are incentivized to defect from the system very often. And you might have to limit this by having an agent that imposes an offset to the payoff matrix to the individuals. And this is what we call a government. And the need for a government comes not from political constraints or from the desire to exploit people or something else. It's just a game theoretic thing that you can derive from first principles. And the purpose of this government is to integrate the total reward, which can happen from bottom up, and to top down do credit assignment to make sure that the individual behavior is adjusted in such a way that the Nash equilibria of the individual agents become compatible with the common good. And this is something that also needs to happen in some sense in our own brain. The neurons are autonomous reinforcement learners. And the interaction between the neurons needs to be coordinated into a coherent structure. And György Edelman has suggested that the organization that happens in our own mind is something that evolves in every individual in some kind of what he calls evolution, he calls neural Darwinism. And so maybe the top-down process that is harmonizing our bottom-up perception is something like a governance, a colonizing agent. So our brain is not just playing free jazz, which it does to some extent, but it also plays a coordinated symphony. It is serving coherent goals. It is has an emergent coherent agent that is forming inside the organization of the cells and makes our organism more efficient by giving it a coordinated spirit. So how is this relevant to AI? Current machine learning representations all have an outside-in design. And in organisms, the representations are different. The organisms are coupled to the environment, so the features are not static. They are functions that basically are operators on your current mental representation to give you the next state. And they're tuned in such a way that they track the sensory patterns. And the features are kept stable and coordinated via individual controllers. So every feature is probably some control structure that maintains its stability and its coordination with the environment. And the entire thing goes beyond jazz by having some kind of emergent governance that harmonizes it and instantiates individual features and resolves them when they are no longer necessary, destroys the attractor states with some governance, for instance, at the level of the scene that you currently use to interpret the world. And you have multiple systems of interacting agency in there. Within the scene agent that is trying to predict how the world continues, you also have a self agent that is driven by the motivation of our organism. And you have an attention agent that is figuring out which features to select and harmonize and to instantiate and to dissolve at any given moment. And in this way, organisms can have a centralized causal structure, but the centralized causal structure is not like a CPU in a computer. Rather, it's more like the centralized causal structure in a society of people. that emerges as a result of an evolution that makes the society more efficient and better at competing with other societies. So this is where I end for today.
Thank you, Joscha. Right, so now we are to the discussion part of the session. Let me see what we have in the chat for questions. So first of all, please feel free, if any of the panelists has comments about each other's presentations, please feel free to voice them. And in terms of questions, so first question is from Thomas McGee, and it is not, it was posted, I believe, during György's presentation, but it may have been to anyone. What are some examples of multi-stable and metastable neural attractor dynamics? Would the slow fluctuation of externally oriented delta theta dominated oscillations and internally oriented alpha beta oscillations be an example of an endogenous multi-stable attractor dynamic in the brain? Also curious about some examples of neural heteroclinic cycles.
Well, it's a charged question, and there are many components to it. One of the most beautiful things in brain evolution about scales is brain rhythms. Now, what you would like to know in general about scaling is that what do you want to preserve, and what are you allowed to sacrifice? So brain rhythms are extremely useful on this because they are pretty much the same in every single brain, at least in the mammals, from the mouse to the human. And the mechanisms are the same. The pharmacological sensitivity is the same. The second interesting thing is that they form just to finish this line, which means that the most important thing for the brain is to keep timing preserved. And the reason why timing is so important is because we control muscles, and the muscles are the same in all species, and the speed of the muscle hasn't changed in evolution at all. So other creatures have pretty much the same speed. So that's probably one of the evolutionary pressures that allowed or forced to keep timing the same. And then you sacrifice a lot. You sacrifice the structure. You put a lot of lines, that is axons, in a larger brain that are much faster conducting, because you have to deliver the information in the same time to a more distant target. So then the calibers of the axons grow and so on. And these are beautifully demonstrated by comparisons of the fibers in the corpus callosum and in the retina, the optic tract and so on. Now, these oscillations or rhythms that this questioner asked about form a beautiful hierarchical system. The hierarchy's organization is simple, which is called phase amplitude coupling, which means that the lower oscillations phase modulate the amplitude or the magnitude of the faster one, and the phase of the faster one modulates the amplitude of the even faster one, and so on and so on and so on. So the consequence of all this is that when you have a short period of time and you've got a short period of an oscillator or short waveform, then only events can occur locally. When you have more time and then you have a slow oscillator, then it engages all the other ones in a larger neuronal space. The consequence of this, very different from AI probably, this is, if I understood it right from Dave, he alluded to this, that we try to deliver stuff to distant architectures rather than just to the neighbors. Now, this is what the brain does in both ways, namely that most of the organizational pattern is local, but the large oscillation is allowing that local computation is broadcasted locally, globally a little bit, and the global computations, that is the global oscillations, constrains what goes on in any local situation. So this hierarchical system allows you to have a brain syntax, to package information in short chunks and longer chunks. So you asked about various names, but for the audience, it doesn't matter. Let's just call the faster ones gamma oscillations, which are about 20, 30 milliseconds. This could be, the content of this is a bunch of neurons firing together with the one and only purpose is to discharge a postsynaptic target neuron. This could be called a neuronal ladder. Now, a theta and an alpha oscillation can concatenate several of these slots, the gamma oscillations, to a neuronal word. And the neuronal word can be combined into a longer segment. So this is the way, I think it was Christoph who already mentioned that, without a generative rule, a syntactical rule, you cannot really grow the information content infinitely. But if you have such a syntactical rule, such as the brain oscillatory hierarchy, then it allows the brain to generate infinite number of sequences from limited number of elements. So this is a complicated answer to the brain rhythms. If you are interested in furthermore, I had a previous book, but that's a short answer.
György, if I can follow up on that, is it the case? So you're saying these brain rhythms are extremely conserved across mammalian species, at least. Exactly. And does that mean that the size of the brain doesn't affect the rate of a given class of oscillation? Exactly. Elephants are going no faster, no slower.
No, exactly.
Even though they have much more distance in just raw centimeters to cover. I mean, exactly. And why the hell would that be? I mean, why? Because you just stretch the axons out, that makes hardly any difference in the propagation time.
So I think the idea of physical systems was discussed a couple of times here. Now, physical systems are different from theoretical creations with unlimited speed and so on. Now, in order to keep if you look at my mark here, it has color and all sorts of features, as it has been studied, and von Malsburg studied about the binding issue. All these things have to come together, but they have to come together somewhere in a small brain and the large brain in the same time in order to perceive it. And they do.
But I don't understand why same time. Why couldn't it be a little longer in the big brain?
Oh, because we are, well, not because, but this is the speculation. I'm interacting with another species and another species and another species and another species. And all of this, if there would be a tremendous order of magnitude advantage, then in speed, for example, I would be dead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would think the short cycles I could expect could be preserved or forced chemically or something like that. But it's the long ones that I would expect could have more variation.
So this is the interesting kick. Brains do this for a goal, and we can talk about the goal a little bit later, because this, if you are interested in what is preserved in the brain throughout evolution, then my answer is timing and the brain oscillation. It's not because the brains cannot do something else. Breathing, which is also an oscillation, a very regular thing, is organized by about a few thousand neurons, that can have several orders of magnitude different in rhythm. The waves and the
heart rate,
so they are very, very different. So if you want, you can do it. But all the other oscillations that are used for cognition and controlling the body seems to be preserved everywhere.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned briefly, that there are beautiful anatomical data showing that the connection between this part of my brain and this part of the brain is about 100 times smaller in a smaller brain. And the conduction velocity is 10 times more in my brain, because it's needed that you get there in the same time.
I see.
The cost is
cancels
enormous.
Out the size.
The cost is enormous because you have to put myelin, and energetically, it's so costly to maintain, to deliver electricity from one place to another. But this is what brains do.
Oh, that's the same in digital manufactured computers. The more metal you have to run, the more energy you pay, the more layers you pay, the more area you pay. It costs a ton if you want to crank this clock the same speed on a bigger chip.
It's a physical system. The brain is just like your chips, in a sense, in that sense.
Thank you.
I have a question too to György. if you look at the organization of the neocortex, how much of that do you think is the result of deliberate circuitry building, and how much of it is just a stochastic substrate? So you point out that the complexity doesn't very much change during learning, right? It's not like the brain starts out with no structure, or the neocortex starts out with no structure after the initial setup, of course. And then it forms all this intricate structure after interacting with the environment. It tweaks the structure, but the complexity at which a child perceives the world is probably not that much different from the complexity at which an adult perceives the world, even though the functions that are being learned are slightly different. But how much of that is basically reflected via the circuitry, and how much is the circuitry just a result of the learning of, for instance, RNA-based memory that is stored in the activation pattern or propensity of the individual cells?
Well, the propensity of the individual cells seems to be preserved throughout much of lifetime. So the firing rate of a neuron is almost like a fingerprint that you can perturb it, you can do lots of things, and it will be the same. Now you take a cortical unit, a cortical module, it's called the column, and then you can grow it. And then many people are very much interested in how the different columns compute something differently in the visual system versus a thinking system such as the prefrontal cortex. But if you look at the connectivity of these two systems, they are not very different. So the commonality is much stronger. So much so that experiments have been done 20 years ago when either a newborn or a prenatal animal is taken out, and you take a piece of tissue from here and you put it here and you change it, there will be a relatively normal brain because the system can tolerate that kind of discrepancy. Now, when you look at a small brain, a large brain, and you say how many different types of neurons there are there, then today or these days, people celebrate if they find one neuron that in the human brain or in a primate brain that looks a little bit different or genetically looks different than in the brain of a mouse, because the component diversity is relatively limited throughout the mammalian evolution. Now, having said that, the neocortex is a modular system. It can just grow because you can add element, and then you need the agent that you talked about, the controller that brings this together. That may be the thalamus that allows all these things to be modulated together, work together. But there is this different type of organization called the hippocampus, which is a single giant cortical module. It is the same structure. There is no modularity in it. It just grows from the tree shrew to the whale, and it gets larger and larger because it is quote unquote designed as a random graph that you would like to go from anywhere to anywhere else in just 2 steps. And that may be an interesting thing, why, and I don't have a good answer, nobody does, why do we have these external loops? Why does the neocortex cannot solve the problem of what the hippocampus can do? But what I learned today is that even in computer science and everywhere, architecture is the primary thing that determines, form defines function, and the brain is not an exception from this. In fact, it's, I think, the prime example.
Thank you, György. So we have a question from Willy Schroll to Christoph and György. Looking at your insights, is the current architectural paradigm for artificial neural networks still stuck in an architecture, ignoring the endless loop with environment paradigm of real organisms? So despite the deep learning advances, will we continue getting more stuck? This question has a postscript saying some alternatives like cellular automata still totally miss the feature of being massively looped or massively parallel. In my opinion, also a dead-end street.
And I answer to that. I take it as asking, is deep learning the end of the story, so to speak, and can that be continued indefinitely by just enlarging the system or enlarging the training sets? And my opinion here is that deep learning is stuck. The main problem being that its a priori assumptions, its fundamental data model is not tuned to our environment. It may be tuned to some particular application fields, but as far as we are after animal type, human type intelligence, deep learning doesn't have the right data architecture. That is the reason for it being very poor in generalizing. You know, if you show a new kind of object to a 3-year-old child, the child gets it after the inspection of a single sample of that object and recognizes it in under massive changes in color, in exact shape, and so on. So what deep learning is poor in is its feed-forward architecture, which is forced on it by the necessity to backpropagate the error. This is a very poor data format. And as I've tried to point out, self-organized networks, which differ from what we have today in deep learning structures fundamentally by having cycles of connectivity, you know, lateral connections between within a layer, if speaking about a layered system. So I think the enormous efficiency with which animals learn or humans learn is something which is beyond reach of the deep learning paradigm.
Christoph, I have a question about the Kolmogorov complexity. If you think of physics, the Kolmogorov complexity of the universe might be very low in the sense that it could be a fractal which has a simple generator function. But the complexity of the particle universe is extremely high. Right? So if we try to describe the detailed fine-grained structure of the universe around us, we would need an enormous amount of code because we cannot compress it very well, because we don't have access to the underlying function and our position in the fractal. But the description that we are making of the world with Newtonian physics and basically the game engine that our mind inhabits, again, has a much, much lower complexity. So there's basically an emergent causal structure that we use to predict the world that fascinatingly works quite well. And that can be described efficiently in what you describe as a gigabyte of code, probably a lot less if you write the code down more efficiently than we do. And now an interesting question is, what is the actual Kolmogorov complexity of our mind, right? The complexity of building a brain by setting up a self-organization process between the cells is probably relatively low. It's not the entire gigabyte of genetic information, but probably more in the order of kilobytes or megabytes that are required to basically form out the brain as in the self-organization process. But what is the Kolmogorov complexity of the emergent system? If we were to design the brain as an engineering project from the outside in, is this going to be similar to the Newtonian world, where you have a relatively efficient structure? Could we come up with classical AI architecture to describe the brain efficiently? Or do you have to deal with the fact that the effective structure of the brain is going to be very complicated, so you will need to have a self-organization to understand it?
Well, my argument was, of course, that the brain is of low Kolmogorov complexity because it can be built with so little genetic information. As you said, some people claim or have computed that the 3.3 billion nuclear bases can be compressed to something like 50 megabit. So the complexity is very low. And in order to build the brain, you need a process of self-organization that, as we know, starts with a single fertilized cell and goes through divisions and goes through a sequence of attractor states. That's the way the brain is built. Now, our way of building outside in completely ignores such constraints as are implicit in the organic growth from one state to the next. We can when putting together a blueprint, we have the full universe of potential patterns we can throw onto our blueprint. And the only constraint that we are observing is the design ideas we have in mind. So I think, of course, you can, by knowing the procedures of self-organization, the mechanism of self-organization, you can let them play in your computer that you use for the design and get the final result, and then impose that final result outside in on a piece of hardware. But I find it pretty against the nature of things to do that. So I think complex brains, artificial brains, will be built inside out. And if only they are constructed on digital computers. At the present time, I'm simulating all my systems, of course, on a digital computer. What can I do? Even on a digital computer, you would rely on an organic growth process, generating the final structure as a sequence of intermediate states. So I think you are stuck with self-organization.
By the way, the reason why I wanted to have Dave on this panel is I thought that it would be interesting to see if there is an interaction between the ways in which he is designing computers via self-organizing principles and the way in which we think in neuroscience and cognitive science about self-organization for information processing.
May I comment on that? He made it very clear that reliability in our digital computers is solely on the hardware level, very meticulously by forcing the signals to decide either for 1 or for 0, with these self-interaction loops driving the signals to saturation. And building on that very brittle, as he puts it, software. Now this has 2 flaws. Number one, the software needs to be designed outside in. There is no way the computer prefers more functional structures. The software prefers more functional structures, less functional structures by itself. So all the functional structures must be brought from the outside in. And number 2, the unreliability he talks about. So if on the software level, you have something that is built on redundancy, multiple pathways, built on attractor dynamics, you can you can live with underlying hardware, neuromorphic hardware, for instance, which is analog, which is prone to a noise that is bridled in by the, if you want to refer to that as such, by the software level, bridled in by what we now have as software. So I'm completely in tune with David Ackley. I love his way of looking at things.
Thank you, Christoph. I mean, you know, this was such a big aha for me because I was raised as a computer scientist. I was raised to be all about efficiency, all about correctness, and then to realize that that was all just purchased on this phenomenal act of redundancy at the amplifier digital signal level, and that, you know, we were just sort of cruising on that ever since. And yeah, so the question is how can you build bottom up in terms of software? And the idea, all that I come up with, is that we build simple agents, and then we build more complex agents at bigger, slower, and more complex agents by combining collaborations of smaller, simple ones. And, you know, exactly how to do that depends on what the actual hardware you're trying to deal with. If you're trying to deal with analog neuromorphic stuff, that has one set of affordances that you now have to figure out how to work with. And if you're working with, you know, I work with, you know, stuff that's a little bit more traditional, like cellular automata, except, you know, best effort only and asynchronous only and so forth. But there's clear set of problems like control of space and how to reduce variation around space so that you can now do something more specific. And if I could take one minute, I could show a little demo that I wanted to show.
Oh, yes, please.
Because it kind of shows the idea maybe. So, you know, one approach is to just make everything big and rigid, right? So here is a block of wall, so to speak. And the idea is, well, but, you know, instead we want to do something more adaptive, more reactive. So this is a simple cell membrane that's kind of knocking around, and oops, and I think I may have just killed it. Let's start a new one. So much for robustness there. You know, if God is going to mess it up, you know, it's not really his fault. But the point is that, you know, the existing stuff that we have tries to be rigid, and it counts on the underlying hardware remaining rigid and so forth. Okay, there's our rigid thing. But one of the things that we do, because there's this terrible problem, you know, if you try to be robust, but there actually is nothing challenging the robustness looks like waste. So there's this inherent tendency to start chipping away at the redundancy, because if there's no actual problems, then it doesn't matter. You can get away with it. So fragility can happen in natural evolutionary processes as well. So one of the things that we do in what we build is we build stuff in to deliberately challenge the system. So one of the things we've got is an element called DREG. It stands for dynamic regulator. And what it does is it just wanders around and randomly erases stuff that it's next to every so often, not all the time. And every so often it just creates a new sort of food particle that can be used for anything. So I'm going to flood the world with DREG right now. And so, you know, what we see happen is the rigid structure gets eaten up, right? But the cell, I want to call it a cell membrane. It's not a real cell membrane, obviously. This is so abstracted away. It actually does active transport to bring the little food particles inside, and it grows. So this is my suggestion, an example, you know, a thought experiment. Well, it's implemented, not exactly a thought experiment, of how you can actually start building up. That you build, first you build small, fast structures, then you build bigger, slower structures out of multiple units of these things. And we just try to keep going up. And at each stage of the operation, we're going to have data sheets saying, you know, this thing is good for this, it'll work at this, it'll do badly at that. If you go outside these parameters of behaviors, it's your fault, and so on. Just like real systems always have data sheets, but computer science never did. And it was, again, because of that same damn determinism that the hardware guarantee was supposedly providing us.
What I really like about your work is that you don't try to imitate brains, but there is beautiful work about spiking neural networks, but where you spikes if you can set arbitrary messages. And so you come under the self-organization from a completely different angle. And I wonder, have you thought about learning systems in this way? Could you build structure that is learning new functions? How would a meta-learning system look like? Because you have to design eventually the meta-learning, right?
The last example that I showed, the function optimizer, as a simple example, was actually implementing the psi algorithm that I did my dissertation on in 1987, and here it is coming back. And one thing that was interesting to me when I was implementing it in the movable feast machine in this architecture is that it was really hard to do a bipartite graph. Where everything was supposed to connect to everything by equally length units, and I ended up not doing it. I ended up doing a crossbar switch and putting, weights at each intersection. But then, since it's all asynchronous, that means that the stuff that's close to the crotch where they meet is much faster. And it's a lot like György's picture where he showed the simple brain and then the bigger brains wrapped around it with the bigger loops, the slower loops. That just fell out in the psi algorithm, in the psi implementation that I did on the movable feast, because once again, we still had space. There's no random access memory. You can't just pretend everything is next to everything. So yeah, I think so. I think it's going to impact the structure of learning systems in a fundamental way. And it's going to be a pain, because right now you can just throw around matrices, you can tensor them up and just do the deep learning things the way people are doing it, and they're having great fun. If I was younger, I would totally be doing that. But I did my version of it in the 80s and I moved on like that. But all of that, all put together, is still under the same, as Christoph was saying, outside in, where you pick the architecture. I've got 10 layers and a concentrator and a convolutional layer and then the transform attentional thing. That's all done by the human, and then it's fixed. And I want to have something that's underneath all of that, that says, we can do these things, but then we can reprogram them by sending down new software, rather than saying we have to throw out the machine and build a new one.
Or maybe that's the brain goal, is to put a lot of effort into making the system resistant to catastrophic interference. And that's the primary goal, probably. Your brain and my brain never experiences catastrophic interference, short of, a car accident or something like that. I liked a lot of statements you had, Dave. My favorite one was this: we have to know what we want first, which is an interesting statement, because this is exactly what AI is about. It has to have a goal. Now, on the other hand, your mind is very fascinated about self-organization. And there are two interesting things here. One is that it just grows and we don't know what the end product will be. The other one is a goal. Now, the funny thing, and this is, I think, what most of the people don't understand out there, the difference between evolution and intelligent design, is that evolution can be explained best with a goal. But that's just a convenience. And of course, evolution doesn't have
tremendously misleading sometimes, convenience, but virtually irresistible.
Exactly.
Because and we think that says something to Christoph's point about low order structure in the environment, so that there is some specific thing to want. It's not just like every possible environmental input is equally likely. There is structure there that our brain is trying to latch onto. And once it finds it, that feels like a goal. I want to get better at doing that. And then we go off to the races. Then we can do deep learning. Once we've got something that says, I want this is a good mapping, then boom, go hill climb and be merry.
I like that. And there's a whole big field, it's called decision making. But it is the natural, intelligent design kind of.
It sounds like it, yeah.
Saint Augustine's definition. But in the real brain, decisions are made post hoc. Most of the decisions that I made in my life, I justified, and it looks like decision after the fact, rather than.
The dig I make is that intelligence likes to think it's the captain, but really it's the historian.
Very good.
There is an excellent question from Kevin to all of the panelists. So what are the panel's thoughts on artificially creating the phenomenal aspects of our existence? For example, consciousness. For example, there is what it is like to recall an episodic memory while basal ganglia learning and memory can operate outside of awareness. Connecting to the ideas of chunking and attractors / complexity, rhythms of the brain, and hardware-software considerations, would we need anything different to go from artificial intelligence to artificial consciousness and qualia? Potentially metabolic or biochemical universalities, or perhaps artificial conscious computing can already be accomplished without the bits of info at the molecular level, like for an artificial hippocampus medial temporal lobe system to create what it is like to encode and recall an episodic memory.
Wow.
Can I give a shot?
Go ahead.
You know, to me at least, the state of consciousness in my brain is one where a large number of modalities like seeing and hearing and wanting and feeling and emotion and the aims I'm after at the present time, where all these modalities are in sync with each other. They speak of the same thing. They understand each other. One responds to the other in a useful way. Like when you drive your car, a signal coming into your peripheral vision immediately lets your arms turn the steering wheel or your foot hit the brake. So the phenomenon of consciousness is one of integration of all subsystems into one coherent state. And I see that as an example of different fragments, connectivity fragments in the different modalities being activated by activating the participating neurons, of course, activated such that they all fit together into one brain-spanning coherent network, a network that, if it was given time, would just recreate and stabilize itself by the exchange of signals. That's how I see the generation of conscious states.
Just to add to that, you know, the organizer is the brain rhythms, the system of brain rhythms. They are the ones that bring all this together. So probably that's why it is so important. And of course, you can see the evolution of brain rhythms and you can study it. Your questions, the questioner, is more complex. I don't think anybody can give a one-sentence explanation about qualia, but I can give you an explanation about the role of the hippocampus, for example. So I take out my hippocampus and I will probably still know I'm György Buzsáki. I can do a lot of things, except that I will be missing my past. I will be missing what is called the noetic consciousness. That is, I don't know whether I was an agent of an episode or not. I don't remember anything about my life as being a participant of this. And this is done entirely by one system, this side loop of the hippocampus. Now, what kind of consciousness is this? It's a good question because you will say, well, you are awake, fine. You know your name and you know that you are distinct from others, but I don't know who I am in terms of my history. So I'm just a zombie that lives in the environment and responds according to the socially agreed norms. This is the kind of thing that I think AI can do not so long from now, but the feeling of it, or being you and putting you as the first person experiencer. This is the big question, is that when an AI system can be saying that I am the viewer, I'm the first person experiencer, rather than the third person describer of the events out there.
I'm a bit more optimistic than you, György. Basically, our model of reality is a model of what the world is like, right? And our model of the self is a model of what our interaction with the world is like. And the model is written force and it informs our future behavior. So basically, it's the historian that is helping the emergent captain that makes a decision based on the model contents. And as a result, the story is continued with the consideration that the emergent captain is making, right? The entire system is virtual. The captain is virtual. The agent that lives inside of the world that we observe as being us is a virtual construct. that is getting causal power, because it would be very useful to know what it would be like for the brain if such a person existed and coordinated the behavior of the organism, right? It's a spirit that is being conjured by the interaction of the cell. And the phenomenal experience that we have, this feeling of what it's like and the content of what it's like, is a model of what it is like to attend to our model of reality. And the purpose of modeling is control. So the purpose of our modeling phenomenal experience in our own mind and being able to access it and reflect on it is to control the attention that we are paying and the way in which we are coordinating our inner reality. So the issue is that we have to grasp that the consciousness is not physical. It's not something that exists at the level of neurons or physics. It is entirely virtual. It's a story, and we live inside of that story. The story is being accessed by this loom that weaves the story to continue the weaving. And the contents of the weaving, when we reflect on it, that is the reflection that we have, that we experience as our inner phenomenology.
Yeah, consciousness is not in one brain. No, the word consciousness means joint knowledge, knowledge of yours and mine. And in Russian, it's called saznania. This is for Tatiana, which also means, a knowledge mirroring from you. Without you, I have no idea who I am. If I'm the only person in my own niche and I'm surrounded only by alligators, I would have a very interesting opinion about myself, certainly very different than living in New York.
Interesting. You could interpret consciousness also by saying that the different parts of your brain know together.
That's exactly the first view, because now you are looking at yourself, but looking at yourself is your past experience, which is
I wonder, György, why you think that this particular function of knowing your own history, of being conscious of your own self in, as you just said, in a social setting, couldn't be modeled in artificial intelligence. Why would that be a barrier?
I don't think there are limits, because there are no limits in our world, right? I just say this is the most difficult thing to do.
Okay.
Looking at the kind of consciousness which is just mirroring that, I know that I'm separate. It's a relatively easy one, because the way how I would approach it as a biologist is say, how can I study these things in an animal? And when I say first person, second or third person view, then I can study an animal of low organization, such as a mouse, because in every animal, the most important distinction is the self from everything else. There are boundaries and so on. This is a biological thing that has to be internalized very early on in evolution, because that's the important thing. And so this is the egocentric world. And then the allocentric kind of thing that comes much later, because that requires that you generate something that is transferable to the other organism, which is one of your species. This is the socialness when it comes up. So all these complicated things, such as socialness and individualness, can come down to the ego versus allo.
I mean, as an engineer, I approach consciousness with how can I build it, or what would it take to make a crappy little substitute for it and say, maybe it's something like this. And I think I can get a little bit, mostly I don't talk about this because I think the appropriate level of implementation is so much lower than it. And consciousness is something that is kind of architectural and structural that is going to seem much less mysterious once we earn our way up to that level of architecture. But I do have a thought about it. And, one of the things is okay, so we're willing to buy Dave's pitch that we have to have more redundancy in software. Software is going to have to start taking over some of the reliability work, which we had said said reliability is a hardware problem for the first 70 years. And so what would that redundancy look like? And I think the best example of, or it's the most obvious, wonderful example is in software is unit tests. That having tests for code is a redundant representation. The format of the test and the procedural code that it's testing are getting at similar dynamics, but they get it in a completely different way. One does it, the other one checks to see if it was done. And so that, you know, it used to be in computer science when I was young, tests were like, oh, because you're too stupid to prove it's correct, you know, but now we live in a different world where if you don't have tests, then you're essentially negligent. So that is a kind of software redundancy right there that is, you know, you can bite it, you can eat it, people love it because it's good. And so to go dot, 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 way past anything that I can actually cover with an implementation right now, the sense of qualia, the sense of consciousness, the guts of it is going to be that we have these redundant representations. One sort of procedural thing that is we're doing that's actually running our sequencing control, what we do, move the hand, do this. And the other one, the historian that folks have been referring to, that is describing what we've done. And we're going to get a kind of matching between those two representations that's going to be like the test going green, ding, and that ultimately is going to turn out to be the contents of conscious experience. That green whoop when the test is passed, we now have told a story of it. That's my engineer story.
Thank you, Dave. So one last question from the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't get through everyone's question. So this one is from Paul Cassidy to everyone. Which thinkers, theories, and concepts are you currently finding most fascinating and stimulating? These can be either directly related to the discussion topics or not. Highly creative and interesting people are the best to get recommendations off of, in my experience.
Thinkers, theories, concepts, most fascinating and stimulating. Jeez. You know, the funny thing is, for all the engineering and science I try to do, I really don't have that much time for nonfiction. So, you know, I feel like I learn a lot, much more about the world from fiction. You know, I don't know how to say it. So all I can say is, at the moment, I'm reading Walk Away by Cory Doctorow, and I'm finding it fun.
You know, two authors who are often cited these days in circles that discuss consciousness are Giulio Tononi and Bernard Bars. And both of them actually talk in different ways about coherence of the state, brain-spanning coherence of the state. In Tononi, the basic idea is the space of all possible states of neurons in the brain is reduced by connection. So if you cut the brain in half, then the two halves are freed to think, to create states they wouldn't be able to create in the presence of the influence from the other half. So that is a kind of, you know, he talks about, of course, entropy and such things. Whereas Bernard Bars thinks consciousness comes into existence by there being a central blackboard, a kind of exchange medium in the middle, in the virtual middle of the brain, to which all the different agents, all the different submodalities can put stuff, and from which they can read stuff. So again, a kind of means of creating order, of creating a coherence in the whole thing. In many of the discussions I've seen, these are referred to as the main theories, whether you like it or not.
So Christoph, what do you think of integrated information, Tononi stuff? Do you buy it?
Yeah, I agreed with his basic idea, But I mean, you cannot make a whole career out of this idea with a phi function. You cannot measure it, you cannot compute it, you cannot deduce anything from it. It's a nice thought. I share the thoughts, but so what?
Yeah, I don't know.
I find too narrow. The different modalities of my brain cannot speak the same language. They cannot communicate in the same language on the blackboard. So they speak different pairs of languages. And so I find that too narrow.
Yeah, to me, it seems it's metaphorical at best. And even if it's a metaphor, I don't know if it's a good one, but
okay.
It seems popular. I mean, just like the Markov blanket stuff seems popular, but it seems, I don't know. I have trouble buying it.
Thank you.
I'm an active reader. I'm an active reader. I read a lot. But I cannot make a short list of whom I would recommend, because every single time I find some great idea, what fascinates me most is that how far I have to go back in history to find the same idea. You always do. So my favorite books are always old.
Yeah, okay.
I remembered you mentioned during the prep session, you mentioned the prepared, unprepared, counter-prepared concepts. Who was that by?
Seligman. I can send you the reference right away. So now, for example, that one is a extraordinary person. When we talk about, in my book Inside Out, I go back in time and I realize that maybe I have to go all the way to Plato, because that was the ultimate Inside Out. But then Seligman and many others, the Breland that we discussed before the meeting, they are great thinkers. Ideas come by every 50 years. Small additions come by every day.
So the brain cycles do continue to lower Hertz.
Very low. Indeed.
A couple of the most interesting current authors, Ted Chiang, I think, and Greg Egan. I think Greg Egan is probably the most interesting philosopher of mind who's currently alive.
Spell his name.
G-R-E-G, and his last name is Egan, E-G-A-N.
I certainly will pitch Permutation City to anybody.
Yes,
and
closer. Yes.
As books to read.
It's also very beautiful, mathematically inspired short stories. He's a very mathematically inclined and physicist inclined person who plays a lot with his ideas in his mind, and it's not story driven. The things that he writes, the stories are vehicles to explore ideas and mental fractals. It's quite beautiful and intricate. But I do agree with György's statement that most of the good stuff is actually quite old. I learned a lot by reading Kant. And I also, with hindsight, I never found Lem that exciting. I grew up with him. And now I realize he's very good. He just was not exciting because he was just the intellectual ground zero where I grew up. It was just so normal. But it's still very good stuff.
Excellent. Thank you, Joscha. So with this, we wrap up. We would like to thank Intel Labs for allowing us to host this event. And we would like to thank all of the presenters for participating and for delivering these amazing presentations and a lively discussion afterwards. The meeting has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. The link can be found in the chat. And the chat log with all the references will also be posted on our website. So don't worry, you don't need to copy paste anything in a rush, it will be there. With this, thank you everyone. It was great meeting you all. Thank you the audience for participating and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks to all our guests, this was amazing. And thank you, Tanya, for helping with the organization and doing the moderation today. Thanks,
yes,
everyone.
Thank you, Tanya.
Nice meeting you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Absolutely. It was great.